to Sandra and Tin to introduce themselves. As I mentioned before, they're calling in from across the Pacific and Australia, which is super awesome. There is a GitHub repository with all the materials that they're going to go through today. And we can put the link in the chat if folks haven't taken a look at it yet. So with that, Sandra and Tin, it's all you.
Thanks, Danielle. I'm just going to try to share my screen. Oop. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is it okay? Good. Yes. Thank you. So hi, everyone. Today's Our Ladies workshop is going to be a tandem presentation from Sandra and I. As Danielle said, we're calling in from Australia, and what we're going to present today is sort of a snippet of what we do. We're both conservation scientists, but what we want to show in the broader Our Ladies group is that there are multiple ways that there are multiple things that we can learn in the basic spatial analysis environment that can be incorporated in not only conservation, but also in your other different work. So Sandra and I are from the University of Queensland, but Sandra is also part of a joint PhD. So she's also affiliated with the University of Exeter, and I'm gonna let her introduce herself in a bit. So yes, this workshop today is going to be a tandem workshop, as I said, by Sandra and Tin. Hopefully it's not too chaotic for everyone. So I'm just going to briefly introduce myself first. I'm Tin, Christine, from the Philippines, and I did my bachelor's there in biology, and has actually only lived in the Philippines until I did my master's, and I was fortunate enough to have a scholarship in an Erasmus Mundus joint master degree program in Europe, and that's on a consortium of different European universities, particularly in Belgium, Italy, and I was also fortunate enough in that Erasmus Mundus joint master degree program. It's a tropical ecosystems program, to visit Sri Lanka. But unfortunately, during that time, that was actually COVID time. So I wasn't able to do as much of the things that would be cool to do in Sri Lanka. But towards the end of my program, I was again fortunate enough to meet my now supervisors for my PhD in Australia, and was able to start working on what I'm currently working on, climate smart conservation planning. But now I'm in Australia doing my PhD, and I have just actually finished my first year progress review a couple of weeks back, and am intending to stay here for a couple more years. And so just to briefly talk about what I work on or what I'm interested in, I am interested in incorporating quantitative measures of climate change in designing marine protected areas, and with a focus in the high seas. So that's essentially a snippet of my background, and on to Sandra for her introduction.
I'm just going to lean over to Tin's laptop to do this. But hi, everybody. I'm Sandra. I'm originally from Germany. I then moved to the UK to do my undergrad in marine biology in Plymouth. And then actually I lived in California for a bit, and I was doing an internship at Scripps. Then because of COVID actually as well, moved back to Germany to do my master's degree in bioinformatics. And also during that master's degree, got in contact with my now supervisors of my PhD, and worked with them already for a year during my master's. And I'm now doing a joint PhD with the University of Queensland and the University of Exeter in the UK. And my focus is similar to Tin's. I also do spatial planning, but I also do more ecosystem modeling, and I really enjoy the development of tools that can help making coding more reproducible in the lab, but also help in stakeholder engagement. So putting all the spatial planning pipelines that we have in a way that people can use them within the lab, and at some point also outside the lab as well. So yeah, that's me. passing it over to Tin.
So before we kick off today's workshop, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what's going to happen. So Sandra and I wanted to show everyone a snippet of what we do, of what we're passionate about, which is conservation. But also we wanted it to be useful for a lot of people and not just very niche. So we are going to go through some basic spatial analysis stuff that hopefully will be useful for people outside of conservation as well. And how we're going to do this is I'm going to be doing the presentation side of things, and the entire workshop is actually divided into 3 different parts. The first part is Spatial Data 101. So it's getting familiar with handling spatial data. And that I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation on that. I'm going to pass it over to Sandra for the coding part. And as Danielle mentioned, there's a GitHub repository with all of the code that will be used for this workshop. We've also prepared an R Markdown with all of the code and also some tips and tricks with coding as well. So take a look at that and follow Sandra with the live code. So after that particular part, onto me for a little bit of an introduction on spatial prioritization. So using the spatial data in the context of conservation, and then coding part again to Sandra, and then onto me if time permits to show a little bit of how we can push this further and to visualize spatial analysis using an R Shiny app. So let's get started with the first part, which is Spatial Data 101. Spatial data is essentially any geographically referenced data. So it's any form of data that has geographical coordinates. And what I mean there is that they have a longitude, a latitude, and some of them might have a 3rd dimension, height or depth, depending on the environment. And so this is literally any type of data that can be visualized spatially. So this is a map of Australia, and some forms of data can be point data. So these point data can refer to, let's say, number of schools, number of universities, weather stations, locations of weather stations, etc. And this is one form of data. And another form could be more continuous. So this is a dummy data, but just imagine if you have temperature data across the entirety of Australia. So what I'm trying to show here is that spatial data is literally anything, as long as they have a longitude and a latitude component to it. So because the most basic thing about spatial data is that they have geographic coordinates, you can imagine that they are showing the location of those particular data in the 3-dimensional Earth. And our Earth is a globe, a sphere. And so this has different coordinates from what we want to show in a map, which is, as you know, 2-dimensional and flat. So we then have the term projection. So we're trying to project what we actually have in the global 3-dimensional Earth into a 2-dimensional flat map. And so we do this actually in GIS tools, or geographical information system tools. And the term that we use here is to project these points or these data, spatial data, is a coordinate reference system. And just to give a little bit of an overview of what this means, again, there's more information on the R Markdown, and we're happy to answer any questions later on if this is not super clear for everyone. But the most basic thing is that you need a projection to show these spatial data on a flat map. And there are multiple ways that you can represent the CRS, or the coordinate reference system. First is through an EPSG code. So this is just a numbered code. And you can just look this up online on Google to know what kind of numbered code it is for the different reference systems. This is one of the most common ones. It's the WGS84, World Geodetic System, and this is their EPSG code. But if you use a different projection, you can imagine it looks kind of differently. This is a mole-wide equal area projection, which we will be using in this workshop. This is, I know it's a bit much, but I'm just trying to show that there are different ways that you can represent your coordinate reference system for projections. This is the well-known text format, or WKT, and I've indicated there with the yellow arrows the most important part of this syntax, where it shows the projection that you're using, WGS84, and their EPSG code here at the bottom. But what we're going to mostly use in the workshop is the project for string, which is, again, just a syntax for showing what projection you're using. And I know this is a bit much again, but just to highlight certain parts. This first part here shows the mole-wide projection that we're going to use. This information right there shows what geographic coordinate system was used, which is the WGS84, and the units. So there are different ways that we can represent the projection in R. And just to give a little bit of an overview again of what type of spatial data we have, there are generally two types of data forms where spatial data can be represented. And these terms might be familiar to some of you when looking at illustrations or photos. So there's vector and raster data. And vector data represent points, lines, or polygons, whereas raster data are composed of grids of cells or pixels. So each of these grids of cells have particular information, again, spatial data. And you can imagine for the vector side of things, each point or line or polygon has an associated attribute or data with it, which makes it spatial data. So just to visualize how that would look like, you have points that have information in them, and you can just translate that to a raster, a grid of cells. The same with lines, and the same with polygons. The most important part of vector and raster data is that they have pros and cons. I'm just going to briefly go through them. There's more information that are marked down, but basically vector data is good for visualizing not visualizing, but storing categorical data. And raster form of data is better for continuous data. But again, these two are very interchangeable. For vector data, there are better storage options for a spatial layer characterized by many attributes. So for example, you have a point that has a lot of different information in them, maybe number of people, the sovereignty, the actual country itself, and many, many more attributes. Vector data would be good for that, whereas raster has better storage options if you only have a spatial layer that has one attribute, but for example, you have it globally. Maybe you have global temperature on a high resolution. Raster would be better for storage on that. And just to briefly talk about geographic information system tools, these correspond to tools that analyze and display geographically referenced data or spatial data. And some of these would be, might be familiar to some of you. The most well-used GIS tools are ArcGIS, QGIS, and Google Earth Pro. But what we are going to show here today is that you can also do all of this stuff in R or other programming languages like Python. And the most important thing about doing all of this spatial analysis in a programming workflow is that it makes your workflow reproducible, and it makes it makes it so that it's easy for you to do a particular spatial analysis and how that trickles into the next part of your workflow very easily in a programming workflow. And this is something that you might not be able to do easily with tools like ArcGIS and QGIS. So today, Sandra is going to mostly use spatial data from the Galapagos Island. We'd like to thank the Marks and Planning platform team for allowing us to use the spatial data that we'll be showing here today. Importantly, for everyone online, the spatial data was actually used to design the marine protected area in the Galapagos. So we're not using pre-canned, predefined data. Here, we're actually using what was used to design the MPA there, which is actually pretty cool. And on to Sandra now for the coding part.
Thanks, Tin. So
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. So everybody who actually wants to code along, it would be great if you could navigate into the folder where you have downloaded the files that we have prepared for today. So just to show this as well, Tin and I, we made a HTML file or an R Markdown where we have, sorry, I'm just going to minimize this. Move it. So we made a markdown where you can actually see all the code that's also going to be covered today, but then we give a lot more information than what I can cover in the actual coding part now for the first bit of the workshop now, but then also the second one. So feel free to check that out as well. If you have questions or you want to go back to it after the workshop, there should be a lot of information in there, but if you can't find the information, feel free to contact us as well. So going back to this, you can just, for those who might be a bit new with R, what we did here was we created a project, an R project that contains all the information, all the scripts, all the data that we're going to be using today. So you can just double click on this to open it. I already have it open, so I'm just going to navigate to R. And so if you look on the right here, you can see that we have now all the files that are saved within our project. We have our different scripts. They're ordered sequentially. So if you want to afterwards reproduce what we've done today, you can just follow the order here and you should be able to run all of it. We also have several folders. So we have the one with the input data. Most of this is the data from the Galapagos that Tin mentioned before that we are fortunate enough to use. But then I also included some extra data that are just different file formats to show you how to load different types of spatial data. And then we also have some folders where you can save our figures after creating them and saving output data. Okay, so now to the coding. I'm just so you can see it better. So first of all, we're going to load all of the packages that are going to be needed in this particular script. Feel free to run that too. And just in saying upfront what I'm going to be doing now in the code, I'm going to mostly explain about the functions that I'm going to be using that relate to any kind of spatial analysis or spatial visualization. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat because Tin will answer all the questions you might have on the side. They can also be non-spatial questions if you're not that familiar with coding and I'm using a function that you don't know. Feel free to ask that in the chat as well, and Tin will be able to answer your questions. So I'm going to mostly talk about the spatial side of things. And the packages that we are loading here are, some of them are related to more spatial information and some are just for the normal kind of packages that we would use even if we're not working with spatial data. For example, the tidyverse that has a lot of packages for data wrangling and visualization in it as well. Then we're going to define the path for our input data and load two different coordinate reference systems. Those are the ones that Tin has shown before. So I'm going to be working with mostly with the Neubert projection today, but some of the data, we actually need the latitude and longitude information, as you will be able to see later. So we're going to be loading both of these. And this is in the proj forward string that Tin showed earlier. We're going to see a different way of doing this later, but we just define everything that we need up front. So just the very basic stuff at this beginning, how do you actually load spatial data? Tin said there is different ways of spatial data formats, the basic ones being vector and raster data, and you have to load them in different ways. The package that we mostly use is the SF package in R. If you want more information on this package, you can go to the R Markdown that we shared. It has the link to the package and some more information on it. But importantly, vector data is often saved as a shapefile. So if we want to know what that is, we can just navigate to the folder here, and I have it saved in here. So you can see that a shapefile is actually not just the one that we're loading here. There's actually a lot more information associated with it, even though it doesn't look like we're going to be using it because I'm only calling this particular file here. All this information is needed to actually load it properly. So you can see there's a lot of files associated with it. But apart from that, we just call the stread function to read our shape files and then load this. And what you can see is that this actually, just from the looks in our environment, looks very similar to a normal data frame. And this is kind of the point of an SF object as well. It looks exactly like a data frame. It just has an additional geometry column that gives you the geographic reference of the data that's in there. I'm going to show a bit of a better example later, but this is basically a multi-polygon, so we can see a polygon means it's vector data. I'm also going to be every now and then talk about what's best practice to do and what might be a good thing to do every time you have data. And one thing you should always do when you load data is you want to make sure that's what you expect it to be. So a good thing to do is to visualize the data at the start. The cool thing with SF is that it's really wrapped around, like it's really easy to work with it in a way that you can just combine it with the tidyverse. So you can do very easily like data wrangling the same way you would normally do it in the tidyverse, like using dplyr, but you can also use ggplot to visualize it. So here we can just use the normal ggplot function, and then we're saying, but we actually now want an SF object, and we just want to have a quick look at this. So I can tell you now, you might not be able to, but I can tell you now, this is what we expect. This is actually close to the Galapagos. We're going to look at it in a bit more detail later, but you just have to believe me right now that this is what we want. So you can see that there is different polygons that actually represent the habitat distribution of this particular species. In our case, this is the green sea turtle. And this is like from a habitat distribution model that then has a specific cutoff that now this is the suitable habitat for the species. So this is how you load the vector data. But then we also have raster data. There's different packages on how to load raster data. Now we mostly use Terra and stars. There is also the package raster, but the package is now deprecated. If you use other people's code that's a bit older, you might still see the raster package and just recognize it, but don't use it anymore yourself because, yeah, you can't really work with it that well anymore. So Terra and stars both have their advantages. I think there's some more information in the markdown on when might be better to use what, but it's just personal preference. So I'm just giving you an example for either one. For Terra, you just call Rust, and then we have raster data that's saved in TIFF format. So this is for deep water corals. We're not going to use this data later on. This is just to show you how to load raster data. So this is actually a global data set, and you can see the distribution of deep water corals all over the world, and you can see there's different categories that are distributed over the world. Now we're gonna, sorry, you can see now when you look into your environment that this is saved for Terra, it's in a spatial raster format. This might not be that intuitive if you're not used to working with spatial data as SF, because SF just looks like a data frame. But in the end, you can also manipulate raster in a specific way, but it might be a bit more tricky to get into at the beginning than working with SF. And then we could also load exactly the same file, so deep water corals using stars, and plot that. And you can see like it looks a bit different, but in the end, it's the same data, right? Like you also have your categories, they are distributed all over the globe. Same thing, just a bit different way of loading it. And you can see that instead of using it in the spatial raster, this is now saved as a list. So it's just different packages have different ways of storing data. Doesn't in the end make a big difference. Just remember what you use to load it, because that then determines how you can manipulate your data. And the last one that I want to mention, just because it is often useful for ecologists, so there's probably a bias here in what I'm showing you, is that you might have data that is actually saved in a CSV file, so more like an Excel table, where you have information about longitude and latitude. So this data is, again, not from the Galapagos. This is from Costa Rica. This has been provided by someone in our lab, Jaime Restrepo, who tags turtles all over the world, but specifically in Costa Rica, to look at where they're going afterwards. So if we load this now, just with a normal read CSV, and then navigate into this file that I creatively named Turtle1, you can see that this is the file for the information for a single turtle. So this turtle is called Peach. And it has a lot of information that is not actually relevant for us right now. You can see it has the date information, the time information, so where the turtle moved at what time and what day. And then importantly, you have the geographic information right now, right? You have latitude and longitude. But this is literally just a normal table. This is not geographically referenced now, even though the information to do the geographic referencing is here, it's available. So we now need to make it so it is geographically referenced, right? So we can actually do spatial analysis on it. And for that, we first of all, we don't want to have any NAs in there because we can't work when there's NAs in latitude or longitude because you can't give it a reference. So we drop the NAs. And then we convert it into an SF object. And to do that, we just use the st as SF function that's in the SF package. And then we need to tell it what columns to use for longitude and latitude. So I'm saying use the longitude column, use the latitude column. And then we also need to provide a coordinate reference system. In our case, it's the basic one that uses latitude and longitude, so WGS 84. So now if we do that, we can see we have one additional column here. That is a geometry column. So this is now exactly the same as you saw before. We have longitude and latitude information here that is now geographically referenced, and we can now actually do spatial analysis on this file. And we're going to do a little bit of it. So we're now going to do some visualization because that's super important to actually visualize the data. First of all, we want to just do it the very basic one that I already showed above. So just using ggplot for SS objects and then saying what data we're using. So you can see it kind of looks like tracking data. You have like points every now and then. Again, right now you still have to believe me that this is Costa Rica. But you can see it kind of looks what we expect it to. Like it seems like it's moving somewhere and then it's spending some time at the top for doing some foraging activities. But you might not want to believe me that this is Costa Rica. You might actually want to do this yourself. So for that, we might want to extend this plot a little bit, and we might want to put a landmass here, for example, to show that this is Costa Rica. For this, we're going to use the package that's very important, which is Our Natural Earth. And Our Natural Earth contains a lot of information on countries and even smaller level in countries, but also larger level in countries. And we can say what class we want to return. And that's actually pretty important when you want to put different files together and plot them in the same way. We want to have them in the same class. So we actually want this as an SF object. And then again, very importantly, if you want to plot different SF objects together, you need to make sure that they are in the same coordinate reference system. So Tin showed you at the beginning 2 coordinate reference systems next to each other. One was the WGS 84 and the other one was Mollweide, and they don't overlap. They look different. So if you don't have them in the same coordinate reference system, you would first of all get an error, but also it wouldn't make sense to actually plot them on top of each other. So we want to transform the CRS, and put it in the latitude, in the longitude, same CRS that we loaded before. So then you get all of this. You can see that just by looking here, that we have like all the countries of the world now, alphabetically the other way. But you can see we have all of that. So now we can use this information and plot it. So if we say now we want to, again, use ggplot and we want to use the GeoMSF to plot the world data, we want to color the countries in light gray and want to have an outline of it in black, we can do that and then just layer the turtle data on top of that. I'm going to do that and then you can see what the problem might be with that. So what I did here was I got all the data for the whole world. So now when we're plotting this, you can kind of see that there's like a blob here that is our turtle tracking data, but it's not actually very useful for us. So we might want to crop this to the extent that our data actually is to be able to look at it properly. So how we do this is we use another function from ggplot, which is the coord.sf function, and that kind of allows you to get the limits of your data extent. So we get the x-axis limits of the turtle 1 data, and then we get the y-axis limits of the turtle 1 data. And if we then plot that, you can see that that looks a lot nicer. So we can see that down here is Costa Rica, and then the turtle moves along the coastline and then does some foraging activities here. So far, this is done all in ggplot, but ggplot is actually not the only package that you can use to visualize data. So I'm just going to show you some quick examples of other ways to visualize data, because it's in the end, again, only a preference thing. It's not like, oh, one is better than the other. There might be some advantages based on what you exactly want to do. But in the end, it's personal preference. So the next package that we're going to look at is TMAP. And for TMAP, you first of all need to create a shape that you with your data and then tell it what you want to do with it. So we want to have, you can see we want dots because we have point information. So it's pretty intuitive, TM dots. And for now, I'm saying I want to color it based on the deploy ID. I want to use blue data, and I want to have a title in there as well. So if we do that, you can see that it's all the same color, because I told you before, turtle 1 is only one turtle. It's the turtle that's called Peach. This is actually what we would expect to see, because we expect it to be all the same color because it's one turtle. Okay, so another thing that is pretty cool and that we might want to do is we might want to have an interactive map. So for that, we can use the package Leaflet. And for Leaflet, the data needs to be fairly small. So what we should do at the beginning, sorry, I just need to move something around on my screen, is we need to check that the data is small enough for us to use Leaflet. In our case, it's pretty small, so we can use it. And then you just literally call the Leaflet function of the Leaflet package. So you want to add tiles, and then we also want to add a circle made with dots. So we have a radius. And then if we do that, it's pretty basic plotting still. So you can see that we now have the points again. But importantly, you can now actually zoom in, interact with the map, look where the turtle has been at what time. Sorry, not at what time yet. We're not there yet. But you can see where it was. So we can see that here is Tortuguero, which is where Jaime actually is a national park, and it's the beach where you have the largest nesting of the green sea turtles. So they are fairly easy to tag there because they're on the beach. So what Jaime did was he tagged the turtle, and then the turtle, when he went back into the ocean, took that tag with it. So yeah, it's a bit easier to explore things on here compared to the other maps that we've looked at before. But now you just so far have to believe me that I tell you the turtle was tagged here and then it moves along the coast. We can't actually tell that from the plot, right? Because it could also be tagged here and then move down. So we might want to actually color this based on time. And for that, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. So what we're doing here is we're creating a new column based on the information available in the data. And we're using the looper_date function here to create, it's similar to geographically referencing something. We also need to tell in R the functions that this is now a time reference column. So that's what we're doing here. We reference things based on time. Again, this is not spatial, so I'm not going to go into detail. If you have questions about this, you can ask Tin. So we're just making a new column here. I can show you, and that now actually has the date time information that we also had before, but it is it's temporally referenced now. So and then for TMAP, we need for Leaflet, we actually need to tell it how many time steps are there. So we need to get the range of the time, which is what we're doing here. And then we need to say, okay, what color do we actually want to do this? And we want to have the oranges, which I defined here. It's just the code for calling that. And then we can do exactly what we just did before to generate this plot here, but we add some more information. We now say we want to have a color that's filled here that's based on this oranges here, and we want to base that on the date time column that we just created. So when we do that, we can now see the darker it gets, the further back we are in time. So you can now actually see that at the beginning here, this is like early on in time where it was tagged, and then it moves along the coast and then spends a lot of time here foraging. So yeah, this is what you can do with leaflet. Lots of ways on how to visualize spatial data. You can also kind of get lost in plotting spatial data. You can do so many different things with it, right? It's pretty cool, and there's lots of packages out there. So if you have something specific you want to do when it comes to visualizing spatial data, there's probably someone who might want to do that before. So look if there is like packages out there for that. And yeah, when I made this script, I thought it might be funny to actually create an animation and have the turtle move around. We are not going to go into that code now, but it's available here and you can go into it in your own time. So this is, it's also in the markdown. So yeah, this is how it looks like. So you have the turtle starting at some point, and then you can see where it moves at what time, and we have that time information at the top. And we can also use, instead of using the black dots here, you can see I also included a custom image instead of that, which doesn't need to be a kind of ridiculous looking turtle. It can actually be something that's more scientifically important. But yeah, there's lots of things that you can do with that. Okay, so for now, we've mostly done plotting and visualization. What's really important is actually working with spatial data and manipulating the spatial data. So I'm going to show you some of the important things now of what you can do with it. And importantly, I'm going to be using the Galapagos data now. But here I will generate the data, but then we're actually using data that I manipulated before and using the one that they provided with us in MarkSense. So we're using exactly what they used before. But we're only going to be using Galapagos things from now on. So another important package, especially for those who are working more in the marine realm, is the mRegions package, which gives you the possibility to download different ways of defining regions in the marine environment. So for example, marine provinces, some of you might have heard, but also ecoregions. And those are the ones that I'm going to be working with. So the ecoregions would also give you the whole, if I just say from that package, I want to get the ecoregions, right? That's the key that I'm using. I then need to tell it which of the ecoregions I want to use. So they are all labeled. And I'm telling you here that the Galapagos ecoregions are the ones that are from 20,172 to 174. So like I said before, when you use shapefiles and vector data in SF, you can actually use exactly the same functions for data wrangling than you would if you just have a normal data frame, which is in our case, dplyr. And here we say we want to filter the data that we get from the mRegions package, but we only want the eco code that's within the Galapagos ecoregions. So this, yeah. So if we do that, that gives us this. So you can see I filtered it for the eco codes that we defined before, and those are the ones for the Galapagos, so northern, western, and eastern. And it gives us a multi-polygon for those. But in our case now, we don't care about northern, eastern, western parts of the Galapagos. We want to have one region that's the Galapagos region, basically. So we want to make one big polygon out of this many smaller or three smaller polygons. And you can do that very easily by making a union of the data. So this way you could get the union, but then union kind of changes the data a bit. So if I run that, you can see we now don't have an SF object anymore that looks like a data frame. We now have a list. We don't want a list. We want back an SF object. So we say, make it back into an SF. And importantly, I told you we want to work with the Mollweide projection for the rest of the time. So then we assign it or transform it with the coordinate reference system to get it into the Mollweide projection. And then this is just a remaining artifact from doing the union. So we don't want this to be called X. We actually want this to be called geometry again, because this is the geometry column. So what we do is just some basic dplyr data wrangling, saying we want to rename this X column into geometry, and then actually we need to tell the SF object again that this is the geometry column. So we're saying this is called this, and that's the geometry. So when we do that, you can now see this is what we would expect. But you don't have to believe me. You should always look at your data. And that's why we're just gonna plot this with the very basic ggplot function that we used a couple of times now. And now you can see that we have one big polygon that has a couple of cutouts here, which is land. So this is doesn't include the land. So yeah, this is kind of what we would expect. And then for the prioritization part of things, Tin is going to go into more detail, but for that or for many other examples, you might not want to like make analysis on this whole area. You might want to define many small areas within that area. So you might want to put a grid on top of it, right? So we can do that. That's a really important function as well. So, but very intuitive. It's just st make a grid, basically. With the data that you want to use and the cell size of the grids that you want to use. Then you need to tell it again that you want it as SF, and we do that first. And now you can see we created a lot of grid cells, but often when you want to refer back to something, you want to make sure that this is in the right order. So we just always, what we do, and you will see this for the rest of the workshop, is we add a cell ID to make sure that the things we are seeing is actually the planning unit that we thought it was. So this is now planning unit 1, planning unit 2, and so on. And we can, again, plot this. So we just use the data, we say what color we want, what size we want, the lines and everything. And then we don't want a legend because we know it's the planning units. We crop it again for the spatial extent that we want, and then we can plot this. Now I've not just called the plot as before, but I've actually saved it as in our environment as a ggplot object. So I need to call that first to look at it, and now you can see we made this grid here. Yeah. So I've included some more code here in case you are interested, because you can make this grid a lot more specific. You can use hexagons, for example. We use hexagons quite a lot because squares don't fit around landmass very nicely, whereas hexagons actually fit nicely around landmass. So there are some more functions in here that we explain that are explained in a bit more detail also in the markdown, but we don't have time for that here, and it's probably also not as relevant to all of you. So if you're interested, you can go into the markdown, and then you can see, if I zoom in here a bit, you can see now that we made a grid that's actually a lot better for the ecoregion that we wanted. So we intersected the grid, and if you look closely, you can see that this is no longer squares, but this is hexagons. And yeah, that's basically all the analysis side of things that we were going to show here. And now Tin is going to talk about the prioritization side of things.
Hopefully everyone can see the presentation. The second part, again, this is us showing a little bit of a snippet of what we do in our work. And this second part shows everyone how we can take what Sandra showed a step further and applying the basic skills that we learned on analyzing spatial data, visualizing spatial data in a conservation context. And particularly, we're going to talk about spatial prioritization. This spatial prioritization refers to quantitative methods that aid in identifying priority areas for a particular action. In our case, that's conservation, while meeting certain criteria. So just a little bit of a note, I'm not going to talk about this. We can talk about this for longer because we're very passionate in conservation, but we are aware that we are pressed for time. So essentially, spatial prioritization is one step in a very long process of conservation planning. And if you want to learn more about how spatial prioritization fits in this long process, I've also included a couple of references in our Markdown, or again, you can email us for any questions that you might have. But spatial prioritization, I just wanted to go through certain terms and concepts that Sandra will go through in the coding aspect of it. The first thing that you need in a spatial prioritization context when you're looking for areas, or when you're looking for priority areas for protection, for conservation, is the planning region, which essentially is your study area. So let's say, for example, you have the entirety of Australia. And you can divide this entire planning region into discrete planning units, and these refer to the smallest unit you have in your spatial prioritization analysis. So the planning units, they don't have to be squares. Some of them can be hexagons, as Sandra has already showed, and you could also have irregular planning units, depending again on the conservation planning problem that you have. Features refer to things that we care about, and they have associated targets. So these targets refer to how much we want to include of these features. So these features in our context, again, in the context of conservation, could refer to different biodiversity layers. So maybe the occurrences of hawksbill turtles, distribution of humpback whales, or abundance of coral reefs, for example, in your planning region. But they could also refer to proxies of biodiversity, such as geomorphic features. And we can probably represent geomorphic features in our spatial prioritization that would ensure certain types of biodiversity being included in the spatial prioritization. So again, features are things we care about, and they can go, again, in different forms. Maybe these points, again, refer to the turtles. And you can imagine we can translate that from the points to the actual planning units in our planning region. And maybe we want to include, for example, a river, maybe in our spatial prioritization. And this is sort of how it would look like when we translate it. And if you have suitable habitats for a particular species, and we translate that to our planning region, this is how it would look like. So just a little bit of an overview of what spatial prioritization actually does. We're going to do a little bit of a demonstration on what happens in spatial prioritization. So we have planning units from A to G, and here we have 8 different conservation features, biodiversity features, and each planning unit has its set of biodiversity features within them. And let's say that the goal is to get one of each of the conservation features. So we want one of each of these species. And we want to minimize the number of planning units that we're selecting. So this is essentially what spatial prioritization does. And let's say, for example, this concept of getting one of everything, or representing one of everything, is one of the most common principles in conservation, which is representativity, making sure you have enough of everything. So what I'm showing now is a very simple example, but it shows essentially what spatial prioritization does and what we want to achieve in conservation. So let's say we are selecting planning unit A. If we selected planning unit A for an MPA, for example, we are missing out on the turtle and the humpback whale. And so that doesn't meet our criteria of representativity. So manually doing the spatial prioritization, you might think, oh, if we include B and C, then we have the turtle and the whale. So yes, we do meet the criteria of representativity if we select A, B, and C. But if you really think about it, this is not really the most cost-efficient way of doing this. If we look more closely, if we select C and E, we are actually achieving representativity without having to choose more planning units. And so this is only showing you how it happens for 7 planning units and 8 conservation features. In an actual conservation plan, you have thousands of planning units and maybe hundreds to thousands of features. So you can imagine this is it's not efficient to do it manually, and possibly you can get it wrong. And so that's why you use an algorithm to help you do the spatial prioritization process. And so one of the things, again, another term that's important in spatial prioritization is cost. I've already mentioned it. This is usually often in dollars, but not always. As I mentioned, it could be number of planning units, so the size of the resulting spatial prioritization. In an ocean and a marine context, costs are often fisheries oriented, but you could also have renewable energy or aquaculture. So these costs refer to the opportunity cost of closing off an area for protection. And one last thing before I hand off over to Sandra is the objective function. This is a bit technical, and if you want to know more about the different objective functions that you can do in a prioritization, Prioritizer, which is an R package that Sandra will introduce, has a really, really good website and breaks everything down really well. So, and we also link that in the R Markdown, so take a look at that. But essentially what we're going to use in this workshop is the minimum set objective function, which is one of, if not the most common objective function used in the conservation context. Basically, this objective function aims to minimize the cost across all selected planning units while meeting all of the targets for the features. And so now over to Sandra for the coding part. I'm not going to stop sharing my screen.
And I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to go back into R, and because we are basically starting new now, because even though I showed you some things that could in theory be used for starting off the data that you need for defining a conservation problem, a planning problem, we are actually going to use the ones that were provided by Mark Sands. So we're going to wipe all of this here. And I'm also going to clean this up a bit. So now we can actually navigate into the second script here. So this is another best practice coding advice I could give. Don't have everything in the same script. You don't want to have scripts that are like massively long. You actually might want to have scripts that are a bit shorter. People can, like, if you actually want to work with someone else, you can point them easier to things it's easier to work with. Yeah, it's a lot better to work with it in that way. So what I did is, for this specific examples, I have one file that's for preparing the data, and then I have one file that's for doing the actual prioritization. In reality, when you have an actual project, you will have a lot more scripts to prepare a lot of the background things that are going into the prioritization. But in this case, we only have 2, and that's the number 2 and the number 3. So we are actually loading very similar packages to what we had before, but the one that's new is Prioritizer. Tin briefly mentioned Prioritizer already. So it's an R package that allows to do spatial prioritization. The most famous way of doing spatial prioritization before Prioritizer came out was probably Marksan. And yeah, it's still used a lot, but if you want a more reproducible workflow, then Prioritizer might be better for you, because you can just actually have it in a script and share it with other people. And also can write a Shiny app, for example, that we might show later if we have the time. So we're just going to start with loading the packages again. And I already said we're going to use mole-wider projection for the rest of the workshop, but there's another way of how you can call that. So that's what Tin mentioned earlier. You can either use the proj4 string, which I used before, or you can use the EPSG code. It doesn't really make a difference at all, just so you see how you would use the EPSG code if you wanted to. So first we define where our input data is again, and now when we look at this data and go to this folder here, you can see already like kind of the terms that Tin just introduced. So we said you need to have a planning regions that you need to subdivide into planning units, for example, squares or hexagons. And then you need information on the features, conservation features that you have there, which can be biodiversity features or, for example, geomorphic features. And then we have a cost that we want to minimize. So in this case, we have all the information in here already. And we have it all in shape files. So I introduced shape files before, so we're gonna do the same thing that we did earlier to load our data. So loading the shape files, then we want to all have it in the Moolvider projection. I'm gonna run it like this first. So this is the official Markson data. So we have a column in here that we actually don't want. So this is the way it is sometimes with real data. You might have to get rid of some columns, or you just want to clean up your data a bit. So we're going to get rid of this column, and we actually don't want to have this as PUID. We just want to call it cell ID because we are particular about our workflows, and that's just personal preference. You can also leave it as PUID. But yeah, doesn't really matter that much. And then we're going to look at it. Or not, if it doesn't want to load. No, there it is. So you can see this looks very similar to what we created earlier. So now this is the area of the Galapagos. We have square planning units because that's what they used. And you can also see that the land has not been excluded yet. So the land information is still on there. But yeah, we're just going to use what they used for their project, which is sometimes what you have to do. And then we are going to load the data. And for this, we are actually going to be using a data format that I haven't introduced yet. But this is one where you actually have to have loaded the data previously in R, prepared it a little bit, and then saved it. And that's called an RDS file, which is R specific. So if we go in here, you can see that all of these are RDS files. They were originally shape files, and I prepped them for you a little bit already because we don't have that much time today. And then I saved them all as in RDS files because they're super space efficient. So they're like very easy to store. So all of these are in RDS files. So we read them, and if I read the first one, which is the fans, you can see that we have a cell ID, which we're going to use to match things up. We have the fan information. So in this planning unit, there's no suitable habitat, but then I'm not going to scroll until I find a 1 now. If you have a 1 here, that means it is suitable habitats for fans, and this is the geometry information again. But we don't want to load all of these different features separately. We want to have them in one big file that contains all of the features. So we need to do some joins here, and joins are actually really important spatial analysis or data wrangling thing that you can do because you want to be able to combine data in different ways. And in our case, we actually just want to add additional columns to the SF object that I just showed you that contains the information for the other features. So for that, we're going to use the left join function. But all of these will also have a geometry column that we don't want because we don't need, I think it's 12 or 13 features. We don't want 13 geometry columns. We know the geometry column. And we say we want to join them by the cell ID, which is also another reason why it's good to have this kind of reference there. We say all of the ones that have cell ID 1, they are in the same planning unit. So if we run all of this for all the features, we can now see we still have our cell ID at the beginning. We have the fan information and the geometry, but now we have all the other features as well. And you can see we have a mixture of geomorphic features, for example, seamounts, but then we have biodiversity features as well that are, for example, tiger sharks. So now we prepared our feature information, but we said already, usually when you want to do a prioritization, you have a cost that you have in the area as well. This can be, for example, a fishing cost. So when you close an area off in a protected area, this comes at a cost to other users that are using this environment. So if you have fishing boats going there normally, and then you close it off, they can't go there anymore. So there's a cost for them. We want to minimize this cost whilst also protecting the biodiversity, but we need the cost information. So the cost data is also saved in the input data, and it's saved as a shapefile. So we just read it in, transform it to have the same coordinate reference system, and then also rename it so it's based on the cell ID. And then we plot that to have a look at it, what it looks like. So you can see here, that the cost is from 0 to 20, and the higher it gets, the more costly an area would be. So you can see we have some areas where it would be very costly to have to close this off and have it as a protected area, whereas other areas would be less costly. And then for prioritizer, we actually just want to combine all of this into one SF object, so we don't have to refer to several different SF objects. So we're doing another join, so we just pack that cost column at the end of our features data SF object that we had before, and also do that by using the cell ID. So we then have the same SF object as before, but now we have this cost column at the end. So that's, in our case, the only data preparation that we're going to do. Like I said, in reality, this is going to be a lot more complex. But now for this today, we're just going to jump straight into the prioritization. And once again, I would like to talk about best practice. And here it would be, you might not want to, or you usually don't want to, jump into all of the individual scripts and like run everything that's in there. So what you would normally do is you have your scripts there and then you source the scripts from the previous script. So I'm going to just show you how that works. I'm going to get rid of that. And then I'll say I source the script that we were just into and where we were just doing all the coding. And you can see it now produces exactly what we had before. And it actually like gives us that out SF object that we're going to be using. Also, just to show you, I also wanted to say that normally when you're using functions, I tried not to use too many functions today to not jump back and forth a lot, but normally you would have another R script that has all of the functions that you use to pre-process your data. And then we also want to source that. In this case, I only included one plotting function to make a plot that's a little bit prettier than the ones that we've already produced. So I also need to source that script. And now you can see in the functions bit of the environment, we have this one function that is in this script that we just sourced here. Yeah, so for prioritizer, when you now look at the out SF data frame or the feature SF object, sorry, you can see that prioritizer won't know what of this here is a feature and what is just additional information that's not a feature. So if I give this to prioritizer the way it is, it would think, cell ID is a feature, and it goes from 1 to however many planning units we have. Same for the geometry column. So we actually need to have a vector that tells that saves all the different feature names that we're then going to be using. In our case, I'm just going to use the feature object because it has one less column, the cost column, that I have to delete. So I'm using the feature SF object. I'm going to get rid of the cell ID, and we're going to drop the geometry, and that leaves us with only the column headers that have the feature information. So you can see that here. We have 13 different features. We will need that later for prioritizer. But we don't just need a cost and features, because how is prioritizer supposed to know how much of each feature to include in a solution? So we also need to assign targets to the features. For example, a very common one is 30% of the suitable habitat of a biodiversity feature should be included in a spatial plan, which is what I would create here. I would create a targets vector that just has 13 times 0.3. This is not necessarily based on anything, but shockingly, that's actually what is used a lot of the time, this 30% target. But yeah, this is the very basic one that's used a lot. You have 30% of each of your features. You can also do it in a more sophisticated way. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but you can base it on IUCN category, how threatened is an organism, what's the spatial extent. If it's like everywhere, maybe you don't need a target that's as high as if it's only found in a tiny, tiny region, right? So there's many ways of defining targets, and it's actually quite challenging to figure out which target to use because it can drive the solution quite a lot. But in our case, just to show you that targets don't all have to be 30%, we are going to say we have some features that are geomorphic features and some that are tracking data. And I say the tracking data is like, we're just saying geomorphic features might have a lot of biodiversity there, but we actually know where the tracking data is that we have biodiversity there. So How do I do this? No. So yeah, we're actually assigning the tracking data a higher target 50% and the biodiversity, the geomorphic features only 5%. So if we do that, we get a new data frame that has the different features, the category, which I assigned also in that code snippet that I just ran, and then the target, which is 5% for all of the ones that have geomorphic, and then 50% for all the ones that have tracking data. And that's for a very basic problem, all you need. That's it, basically. But now we come to the actual fun part, which is running the prioritization. And for that, you need to define a conservation problem. And that's kind of where prioritizer comes in. So far, we haven't actually used prioritizer. We just prepared the data. And now we're using the prioritizer package. For that, we define the problem with the data that we have. So that has all of our feature information, the planning unit information, and the cost column as well. Then we say, these are all the features that we want to include here. And we need to tell it where it can find the cost. Then we need to also say what objective function we use. I'm not going to go into detail about objective functions. We use the default minimum set objective function that says what Tin already said earlier. You have to meet all the targets for your biodiversity features whilst minimizing the cost. Then we need to tell it what targets to use and where it can find those targets. And then we also need to say what kind of solution do we actually want. And in our case, we're saying we want zeros and the ones afterwards, so a binary decision. We say 0 would not be included in a spatial plan based on the information that we have, and 1 would be included. And then the last part is actually quite important, and I hope it worked for the people who want to code to download one of the solvers. Because like prioritizer can't do the solving. It creates an optimization algorithm, and then you need to solve it with something. And the solver is external usually. And there's different solvers out there. We're not going to go into too much detail about solvers here. There's some that are really good and really expensive and free if you have an academic license. And some of them are free and might not be as good as the fancy private ones. But here I'm saying add a default solver. So anything that's installed on your machine could be anything. If you have one of these, if you want to use CBC or the Symfony one, I have one installed where I don't need to run an R package in the background, which is why I'm not running any of these. But if that's what you did and you want to use either the CBC solver or the Symfony solver, you need to run either of that. I don't need to do that here. And then we create our conservation problem. And that creates an environment file that basically has all the information that you can provide with prioritizer that we're also not going to go into too much detail in today. But it gives it basically saves all the information that we have in there. There's lots more that you can do. For example, saying you want your solution to be spatially compact. You might want to include already protected areas that are already in this area or not. Lots of things that you can do with it. We just run the very basic one today. And then you take this problem that we just defined and use the prioritizer function solve. And that's as simple as this to get a solution for your conservation problem. You could save that if you wanted to. I provided the code for that. But more importantly, we want to have a look at it. So we use the predefined function that is in the utils function script and have a look at the solution. And you can see that this is the spatial plan based on the inputs that we selected. You might now look at this and be like, oh, that looks a bit odd because it's a lot of individual pixels here. But that's just because this is literally just the solution that is done based on the inputs that are provided. That means that if we want to have it more spatially compact, we need to prioritize that to do that, or to include more data to have it less pixely. There's many ways to do that, but based on the data and what we defined, this would be the solution. And that's basically it from my side on that.
I am aware that we are over time. Danielle, do you think we have time to quickly show the R Shiny app? Yeah,
we have 15 more minutes, so.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
If there's more,
Great.
you can also focus on the questions instead. Depends on what
Yeah.
people want.
I think we're just gonna briefly show the R Shiny app, I think. Just gonna go to this. So before we show the Shiny app, just very briefly, basically what Sandra showed is a very basic way of doing the spatial prioritization. There are multiple ways that we can improve upon this, but essentially what happens is what the map she showed, let's say there's a scientist, let's say it's Sandra, showing, she's a marine spatial planner and she's tasked to provide a conservation plan for a particular area, let's say the Galapagos. And she brings that map, shows it in front of different stakeholders, let's say fisher folk, policymakers, government officials, people who have a stake in the conservation plan. She shows that map and says, this is what the algorithm shows us. These are the priority areas for protection. And in an ideal world, everyone would just say, great job. Yes, we're going to protect all of those individual pixels. But let's be real, nobody is going to say yes to that particular map. And so people would say, you know, for example, hey, you didn't include that favorite species that I have, or you should bump up the target of green turtles because it's so low, or you should have a different cost layer. And so this iterative process makes this entire conservation process longer. And by developing an R Shiny app, we then made this spatial prioritization process more accessible to stakeholders and more user-friendly. And so we did this for the Weddell Sea. This is in Antarctica, not gonna go into too much detail on it, but again, the R Shiny app was to facilitate stakeholder engagement and make this process faster. So we're just gonna quickly show what we had for the Weddell Sea. Sorry, just gonna share my screen.
Yeah, just reload it.
Starts loading.
Yeah, so what we were thinking is like, it was kind of also an iterative process. We worked with the Norwegian Polar Institute for this. And it was about how can we communicate the science behind this whilst making it understandable to people, speeding up the process and not making it too computationally expensive that people have to wait for ages to actually see the solution. So we have different tabs here. I'm just going to focus on this one here. Where you can select your targets. We only split the features that we included into important ones that were only found or very like restricted to the area of the planning region, and then representative features that might also be found elsewhere have a very large distribution where they are. We can say we want the important targets, the important features to have a higher target. Representative ones, let's say we don't care about them too much. Let's only put them to 6%. Another thing was that it was Tin and I that was the first time we were involved in this kind of process, and we learned how important it is for people to give definitions of things and name things. So rational use was what Camilla wanted instead of cost layer. We don't really care about this because the algorithm doesn't care what you call it. But in the end, we had to go with some of the namings that were suggested to us. And this in this case was rational use because cost layer sounds very negative. Then we give the options of what features to include and which ones not. Let's just say we don't want to include the crab eater seals or the bird areas or the areas of ecological significance. And let's leave all the other ones in just for time reasons, and let's deselect all of the representative features. We also included an option to make that spatial plan climate resilient, which was quite special at the time because this has not actually really been done before in a process for the design of a spatial plan. That's Tin's baby. So that all the underlying code is Tin's work that we included here. I'm not going to do that now because it makes it a little bit longer to run. And then we can just run the analysis. And then it produces the spatial plan. So this is not pre-canned. This is all what we just saw, like real time. It does the prioritization in real time underneath this. It gives a solution. It tells you how much of it was included, how well targets are met. And yeah, you can see because we use minimum set, all the targets have to be met. And then how much the cost is driving the solution. And then we have some other tabs that I'm just not going to show here today. Just briefly, you can see where we have very costly areas here, the darker areas in the background. There was less of it selected than in areas where there was not, the cost wasn't as high. But yeah, I stopped talking now because I feel like we've talked enough already.
So just like to wrap everything up, I just like to reiterate again, what Sandra showed earlier is what's happening here. And so you basically this R Shiny app just iteratively goes through the spatial prioritization process. And by showing this from handling spatial data from the start, using that spatial analysis to do a spatial prioritization, and then now taking that again another step further and putting that in an R Shiny app to facilitate stakeholder engagement in an international conservation planning process in designing an MPA in the Weddell Sea. Hopefully everyone learned a little bit.
Yeah. Sorry that we talked too much.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. We just wanted to show everyone our work as well. And hopefully everyone learned something.
That was really fantastic, you two. You know, have been working with spatial data for a little bit, and I learned so many new things during that. So that was really, really useful. The chat has been very active. Thanks for answering questions on the fly in the chat, and thanks to our participants for also jumping in and adding their comments and sharing resources. That was really, really cool to see. We do have a few minutes left. If there are other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask Tin and Sandra.
I have a non-technical question. What's been like the most challenging and or the most exciting part of your dissertation work so far? There's been a lot packed into both of those, as I imagine. So it might be a hard one to answer, but it just feels like you've seen and done so many really awesome things, both technically speaking and also, you know, from a marine like researcher perspective. So yeah, anything that comes to mind that you want to comment on?
I can start on that. So we've been fortunate enough to be involved in applied processes, but I think both of us are more like, you know, methods oriented. We're very quantitative and
we love coding.
We love coding. And so there are certain things like what Sandra said, you know, talking about the terms and having rational use instead of cost. But essentially, like for me, the most interesting and challenging, I think, part of what I've done so far is to be involved with actual on the ground conservation planning.
Yeah.
So we've been fortunate enough to be involved in the Weddell Sea, designing MPAs for the Weddell Sea, and also now we're working with the Wade Institute to do this marine conservation for different Pacific Island nations. And so having that, like having the quantitative background and, you know, very methods oriented, and having somebody, you know, they have different needs for local conservation planning, and to think about that and to incorporate that in the tools that we develop is actually pretty challenging, but also very, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I also feel like, the engagement, like with maybe not as technical people is the most challenging part, but also like for me, somehow like the most interesting one as well. I love developing the methods, and that will be a huge part of my PhD. But in the end, we are both more like, well, we don't want our research just to be in papers. We would like for it to be actually useful to people. So actually talking to people who might use it and have them a little bit like, not drive necessarily, but have their input. And or maybe you want to think more in this direction, because then it might actually be applied for us on the ground. I think that's super interesting. And what's also really challenging, we are very lucky that we get a lot of opportunities in the lab, and I need to learn to say no to a couple of them.
It's a hard skill to
Yes,
find, but it's important. Also, side question, but is the code for your Weddle C Shiny app on GitHub? Is it public or is it somewhere else?
So the Weddle C one is not public. It's also an ongoing project, and it's now been taken over more by the Norwegian Polar Institute. What we're currently doing, though, is that we are working with the Wade Institute on another really cool thing that we didn't get to talk about at all today, which is not having the Weddle C app was very, very area specific. And it was not actually that, it was reproducible in terms of the code, but a lot of it was hardwired for the area. So what we're working with Wade on right now is making a generalizable app that you can literally throw a data set at. As long as the data set is in the right format, you get a country specific app within, I think we're like at 5 minutes at the moment.
Like,
yeah, we just need the data. And this one, the goal is to make it publicly available at some point in the process. We are not there to have it on GitHub at the moment, but we're slowly getting there, and the goal is to have it on there and have it publicly available.
so it's like a shiny app in a
Cool.
day
Yeah.
concept with Wait, because they're working with a lot of different nations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, taking this a step further and
Yeah.
yeah.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see that one day.
And it's really amazing work. Congratulations to you too. Besides all the like coding and process, I think the work you do is really cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other last questions from the audience? All right. Looks like people are hopping off. Feel free to stick around if you want to chat with any of us too. We'll be hanging on for another few minutes before we shut the Zoom down. But thank you all for joining. Those of you who are still here, it's been awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.